Palestinian leaders sign a Beijing declaration agreeing to form a national unity government. Plus, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu signals a Gaza ceasefire deal could be taking shape. Hello, I'm Arnhem Knight and this is The Heat. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, more than 39,000 Palestinians have been killed and roughly 90,000 wounded since the start of the conflict. For Israel, as many as 1,800 dead, with 116 kidnapped Israelis whose fates remain unknown. It's against that background that representatives from Hamas, Fatah and other Palestinian factions, with China's mediation, signed a joint statement in Beijing agreeing to end years of divisions and form a national unity government. CGTN's Dong Xu has more in this report.
In this conference room, in a rare show of unity, 14 Palestinian groups, including Hamas and Fatah, signed the Beijing Declaration in agreeing to a list of commitments at a reconciliation meeting hosted by China. The reconciliation between Hamas, Fatah, and other groups is being widely seen as a key turning point in internal Palestinian relations. The two main groups have been bitter rivals since a conflict arose in 2006, after which Hamas seized control of Gaza. Fatah controls the Palestinian Authority, which has partial administrative control of the occupied West Bank. As Palestinians try to secure their future, Fatah favors a peaceful approach, in contrast to Hamas militants. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi brought the sides together in Beijing, believing Palestinian unity was a prerequisite for any future solution. After 3 days of intensive talks held in what was called a positive and constructive spirit, the groups finally came to an arrangement.
最核心的成果就是明确巴解组织
The key outcome is the affirmation that the Palestine Liberation Organization is a sole legitimate representative of all the Palestinian people. The prominent point is the agreement to form an international reconciliation government centered on the post-conflict governance of Gaza. The present call is for a truly independent Palestinian state in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions.
As the fighting continues in Gaza, the Beijing Declaration stressed the need for an international conference under the auspice of the United Nations with a full mandate and broad regional and international participation. Wang Yi also restated China's support by taking 3 steps to promote comprehensive, lasting, and sustainable ceasefire, to promote post-conflict governance in Gaza by Palestinians, and to promote Palestine for full membership of the United Nations as a preliminary step to a 2-state solution. Representatives from both Fatah and Hamas expressed gratitude towards China for its support and what they called the promotion of justice for Palestine in the international community. They also expressed the hope that by strengthening the unity of all parties and implementing this consensus, there could be an early settlement of the Palestinian issue. Beijing remains committed as a peace broker in the region, while the unity between Hamas and Fatah are essential for rebuilding Gaza post-conflict. Well, this is yet another historic win for Beijing's diplomacy following China brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year. Dong Xue, CGTN, Beijing.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Aaron Maté is right here with us in the studio. He hosts Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone. Also with us is Khalil Jahshan. He serves as the Executive Director of the Arab Center here in Washington, D.C. And Victor Gao is Chair Professor at Soochow University. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Victor, China has achieved a diplomatic breakthrough here. We've got Hamas, Fatah, several other groups, 14 groups in total, that have signed on to the China-brokered Beijing Declaration undertaking to form a government of national unity. So what are China's broader goals here? How did this happen and what's the significance of it?
Thank you very much for having me. The Beijing Declaration brokered by China among the 14 Palestinian organizations of different kinds is truly a major diplomatic breakthrough. And it is a result of China's consistency, patience, and insistence for the legitimate rights protection of the Palestinian people, not only today, but over the decades. I think this Beijing Declaration, forming the consensus view of all the Palestinian groups and factions, laid the groundwork for a more concerted efforts going forward to promote the two-state solution and full membership of Palestine in the United Nations. Now, this is, I also believe, the only way eventually to engage with Israel for Israel's real recognition of the two-state solution as the only inevitable solution for the internecine Palestinian-Israeli conflict over the 7 decades or so. And I think this breakthrough has been generally widely acclaimed, not only among the Arab people, the Muslim people, the Islamic nations in general, but also throughout the world, including among many European countries. For example, I met with a large group of foreign ambassadors and diplomats in Beijing yesterday, and we actually talked a lot about the meaning of this breakthrough. I think the fundamental meaning of this breakthrough is that the Palestinian people are not left by themselves without any international recognition. China is fully recognizing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and wants to do whatever it can to promote the amicable and just solution of the Palestinian issue. And I would say China fully recognizes the legitimate rights of Israel on the one hand,
right,
but also the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Both need to be protected according to legal ways rather through war and conflict.
Okay, we will be talking a little more about the Beijing Declaration in a few minutes, but first let's talk about the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington. He's right here in Washington, in part to speak to a joint session of Congress. Well, joining us now from Capitol Hill is CGTN's Nathan King. Nathan, this was the 4th time the Israeli Prime Minister has spoken to Congress. This time about half of Democrats chose not to attend Netanyahu's speech. So what did the Prime Minister have to say?
Well, I mean, he didn't hold back. You're right. He's the foreign leader, only foreign leader to have done it 4 times, joint session of Congress. Yeah, about 50, 60 Democrats decided not to turn up. Bernie Sanders, for example, the senator basically said, look, I think he might be a war criminal. There's no way I'm attending this. And of course, Kamala Harris, now running for president, wasn't there because she had a prior engagement. So she'll see him on Thursday, along with sitting President Joe Biden. But there was a real feeling, even though both parties invited Netanyahu, that this is perhaps a mistake. It's from the Democratic leadership. Even Chuck Schumer, the leader of the majority leader for the Democrats in the Senate, has called for him to step aside. And there were huge protests in Israel, as well as here, before he left. Because they really think this is not really about ending the war in Gaza. It's really about bolstering Benjamin Netanyahu's credentials back home and trying to boost his flailing domestic ratings and keep him in office. So there was a lot of that. And, you know, there was a hope that he would come here with an olive branch, work towards some sort of ceasefire, which, let's face it, months of shuttle diplomacy from the US has not achieved anything in the region. But instead, he was very, very vociferous, basically saying, we will win this war against Hamas. We will control post-war security in Gaza. Let's take a listen.
Israel will fight until we destroy Hamas's military capabilities, end its rule in Gaza, and bring all our hostages home. The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
Now, basically, Netanyahu also thanked America for its help, but also essentially saying, look, we need more arms, we need more time. And remember, this is not just a volatile time in Israeli politics, but also here. He's going to meet with Kamala Harris, the vice president, and now essentially the nominee for the Democratic presidential run in November, and Joe Biden on Thursday, then Mar-a-Lago on Friday to meet with Donald Trump. Remember, there's a lot riding on this visit in terms of Netanyahu's domestic rating as well, and be very interested to see if Kamala Harris has a difference with Joe Biden when it comes to aid to the Palestinians and a call for a ceasefire as well.
Right, Nathan, we have been hearing from Israeli commentators and analysts today saying that this was an address that was primarily addressed to an Israeli audience. We are fully aware, of course, that Netanyahu does not have very high approval ratings in Israel right now. But what about the impact here in the United States?
Well, the impact here in the United States is actually going to be clouded. Remember when Benjamin Netanyahu came here in 2015 in the middle of the final bits of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and it dominated the headlines for days. Essentially, there was accusations of him interfering in the process, trying to scuttle the process. There's not so much of that anymore. Why? Well, we've got the whole drama that we've seen in the last week here in American politics with Joe Biden stepping aside, Kamala Harris coming up, Donald Trump's convention in Milwaukee. But there's also another feeling here in the US, which is Benjamin Netanyahu is not as influential as he once was. They see his problems domestically in Israel, but also there's another thing. A lot of protests here, a lot of anger at the Israeli government over aid, or lack of it, to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, continued violence there. What is it, nearly 40,000 dead, and not listening to their closest ally, the United States, no matter how light touch that pressure has been.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from Capitol Hill. Okay, let's get back to the Beijing declaration. Khalil Jahshan, good to see you. You know, we know that there have been deep divisions among Palestinians, the Palestinian liberation groups. Now, in part, they have come together because of this declaration that was signed in Beijing. What impact would it have on the fight for a Palestinian state?
It all depends on the implementation, frankly, because this is not the first time these groups get together. The venue changed. Actually, this is the second or third time with a direct role by China to do that. The content itself of the agreement is very positive. But again, it all depends on the implementation. I mean, talking about essentially the unified support for the PLO as the main representative of all the Palestinian people, talking about the need to hold the Palestine National Council. Palestinians have been talking about that for years. More recently, in this context, for weeks and months, events have taken place in at least 15 different countries, including the United States, about how to arrange and prepare for that type of national conference, if you will, the purpose of which would be to establish what they declared in Beijing, which is a national unity government that coordinates the affairs of the Palestinian people at this time, during this critical time in both Gaza and the West Bank, reaching a ceasefire, proceed with some sort of a peace process based on the two-state solution, and involving all the political parties, totally negating essentially what Netanyahu talked about. He talked about essentially his own vision for Gaza, the end of Hamas, both militarily in terms of its military capabilities, but he also talked about its governance, its ability to govern.
Right.
The purpose of this document is the opposite, is basically to talk about a unified body, a unified approach to basically govern the future of Gaza, but also the future of the West Bank by revamping the PLO, bring in everybody into the fold and moving forward.
Aaron, great to have you right here with us in the studio. You know, one of the complaints we've been hearing from the Israelis for a very long time, over the decades actually, more of an excuse than a complaint, is that they don't have anyone to negotiate with. They cannot negotiate with the Palestinians because the Palestinians are divided. Does this declaration sort of render that argument a little bit invalid right now?
The argument is invalid, but it's always been invalid. Israel has deliberately kept Palestinians divided to prevent its biggest fear, which is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Israel doesn't want that because it doesn't want to recognize Palestinian national identity. Israel is founded on stolen Palestinian land, and Israel claims the divine right to steal more Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank. So they've propped up Fatah in the West Bank, and they've also encouraged the rise of Hamas. Netanyahu was quoted a few years ago in a cabinet meeting saying that the best way to prevent a Palestinian state is to leave Hamas in control of Gaza. So this unity agreement is important. It should not be downplayed, but we also have to recognize that no matter what the Palestinians do, ultimately the real power lies in the hands of Israel and the U.S. They're the ones that have consistently rejected decades-long international consensus of the Palestinian state, which for Palestinians is a massive compromise. They're accepting 22% of their historic homeland in the West Bank and Gaza. Even Hamas at a time signaled that it was willing to accept that. Israel's thwarted that opportunity at every juncture, and it's very hard for them to organize under these conditions of occupation and now a mass murder campaign inside of Gaza. And when they've tried nonviolence, like they did in Gaza a few years ago, the Great March of Return, Israel gunned Palestinian civilians down by the hundreds. So no matter what Palestinians do, they're always going to come up against an Israeli occupier backed by its chief sponsor in Washington, and that's very hard to overcome.
Right, now, looking at the situation right now, I mean, do you have any hope at all that the situation could change, where there could, at some point, be some kind of negotiations?
Well, we have to have hope, but to me, that's a question especially for Americans to ask, because without U.S. support, Israel could not carry out its decades-long expansion of its settlements in the territories and occupation of Palestinians, millions of them who have been deprived their basic rights for decades. So to me, the hope lies in the streets of Washington. We saw today thousands of people coming out to protest Netanyahu, people demanding that Palestinians be recognized as equal human beings, which the entire Israeli project is predicated on denying. And they have right now the backing, as we saw in Congress today, of both political parties. And the hope lies in being able to overcome that. And I do believe that with popular struggle, it is possible. And certainly Palestinians have done everything they can over the years, but it's very hard when you have the world's largest powers backing a military occupation.
Khalil Jahshan, getting to Benjamin Netanyahu's address to the joint sitting of Congress, I mean, we heard it there in that soundbite that we played a moment ago. He said Israel will preside over a, quote, demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza and will retain overriding security control there. I mean, we talked about 14 Palestinian factions coming together earlier on. Is there any one of those factions that's going to buy that?
Absolutely not. Not only the 14 factions, but even the mass of Palestinian population who do not necessarily subscribe to this group or to all these 14 groups. There are a lot of independents in Palestine that do not belong to these parties. I don't think you're going to find Palestinians even in Gaza. The Israeli government tried it. They tried it in the West Bank before with village leaguers. They tried to do something with traditional families and like local mafias, most recently in Gaza, in northern Gaza and other parts of Gaza City and so on. It did not work at all. They did not have any success in recruiting people. Essentially, there is a general consensus. It's not necessarily ideological. It's not total unity of action, but there is a general understanding among all Palestinians of all walks of life what needs to be done. There needs to be an end to occupation. There needs to be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and a serious peace process that will cater to realizing the basic or fundamental rights of the Palestinian people to independence and their own state, their own place under the sun. Short of that, I don't think you're going to find many Palestinians that will accept the logic or the words that we heard enunciated by the propagandistic speech by Mr. Netanyahu today. I mean, if you were looking for a non-starter, the speech, it might have resonated with some Israelis. It might have resonated with some Americans. It might have resonated with the majority of those in the room who are basically willing to pander for Israel and its supporters, but it's not going to resonate in Nablus, in Jenin, in Gaza, in Rafah, or anywhere in Palestine.
Victor Gar, no matter what happens, there's going to have to be some kind of honest broker involved in this to bring some kind of negotiated settlement about. But what do you make of the fact that the U.S. Congress today, both houses, welcomed a leader whose government and country was taken to the International Criminal Court on genocide charges, and there he was addressing the United States Congress?
To me, this is the real irony of the day. As one of the panelists just now correctly pointed out, without the massive so-called unconditional support of the United States to Israel, Israel cannot really carry on such policy of depriving the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, grabbing their land, setting up illegal settlements in the occupied land for all these decades. And I believe sooner or later, the general masses of the American people will realize that while they want to protect the legitimate rights of the Israelis, for the Israeli government and the military to kill at will the Palestinian people, to disregard the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, and to treat the Palestinian people not on the par with the Israeli people, but as second or third classes to be discriminated against and with their rights to be deprived of, is not really the decent side of the American society. I hope the American people will realize that they are a people of decency. They should care about the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people rather than wantonly to support the Israeli side of the equation to the complete disregard of the Palestinian people. The massive amount of student demonstrations on many American campuses, some of which I witnessed with my own eyes during my visit to the United States, was really raising this kind of legitimate voices. And I hope members of Congress would listen to their own constituency and figure out a better way to deal with this Palestinian-Israeli people. Time may be very long, but I think we need to be patient, and justice actually has long arm eventually.
Aaron, for a very long time, there's been very strong, powerful, bipartisan support for Israel, for Benjamin Netanyahu. As I said, it's the fourth time he addressed Congress there. But do you detect that that kind of rock-solid support might be weakening to some extent? I mean, we had almost 30, more than 30 Democrat members of Congress who didn't actually attend this address today. And as Nathan told us earlier on, you know, there appears to be a weakening of support for him.
I do think there's some reduction in support because Netanyahu is just so out of control. I mean, first of all, again, he's committing mass murder right now. He has the blood of tens of thousands of people on his hands committed with U.S. weapons. And it's just gotten so, it's so improbable. It's so hard for people to process. And I understand why people then wanted to stay away today. Bernie Sanders, though, called Netanyahu a war criminal, and that's why he said he couldn't attend. Well, if Netanyahu is a war criminal, why is Bernie Sanders standing shoulder to shoulder with Joe Biden, who's arming the Israel leader who Sanders calls a war criminal? But yes, it is positive, I think, that you see more of a divergence. But Rashida Tlaib was the only lawmaker on the Democratic side who actually showed up and protested Netanyahu and called him a war criminal, defying threats from House Speaker Mike Johnson, who said he would arrest people who dare to protest Netanyahu, as if Netanyahu was the leader of the U.S. and not of Israel, a foreign country.
Yeah, she held up some signs there.
Yeah, she held up a sign calling him a war criminal.
That's
she could have
right.
said mass murderer as well. But I wish more people would join her, because it shouldn't be left to the only Palestinian member of Congress to do that.
Right, Aaron, let's talk about something that's been making a lot of news this week, and this is Vice President Kamala Harris, who's going to be the likely nominee for the Democrats. Now, normally she would be sitting right behind Netanyahu, in this case, on that platform with the Speaker of the House. She wasn't there. Somebody else took her place. Why do you think she wasn't there?
Well, I'd like to credit the tens of thousands of people who voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary, especially in the battleground state of Michigan, to protest Joe Biden's policy of unconditional support for Netanyahu's campaign in Gaza. Democrats are alarmed that they're not going to have the votes they need, especially in these key battleground states, because people are so appalled by Biden's policy of bear-hugging Netanyahu and giving him weapons to slaughter people inside Gaza. So the people around Harris, I think, recognize that he's politically toxic, and therefore it wouldn't look good for her to stand or sit behind him as he delivers lie after lie, justifying his mass murder campaign. But I think for people whose votes depend on this, they'll need to see more from Kamala Harris than just skipping a speech. What concrete actions is she willing to propose, to put forward, stand behind, starting with stopping arming Israel as it slaughters so many innocent people? That's the kind of concrete action from Kamala Harris that people will be looking for.
Right. Khalil Jahshan, according to the United States Secretary of State, negotiations for a ceasefire are very close to being finalized, although we did hear from a Hamas spokesman today, a Hamas spokesman speaking in Egypt, who said that Netanyahu's speech was full of lies and he failed to cover the crimes of war and genocide his army is committing against the people of Gaza. The spokesman said Netanyahu's presence in the U.S. Congress shows that he does not want to conclude any kind of ceasefire. I mean, listening to that and listening to Benjamin Netanyahu today in Congress, is there any likelihood, do you see, of a ceasefire soon?
You can never say no in politics. However, we've heard those promises that the Secretary of State reiterated. We heard them again from Mr. Netanyahu, insisting to these cheering members of Congress that right now, as I speak, negotiations are proceeding forward. He did not share any detail. He wanted to wait till he met with President Biden. Before that, I do not hear any evidence from, let's say, the mediating parties that things are moving forward. The issues are still stalemated the way they have been for weeks. And as I said earlier, the speech by Mr. Netanyahu was a deal breaker, even if there was a deal in the works earlier today.
Aaron, we've got about a minute left. There was a UN report that was released that says that Israel killed 366 UN staff and family members. That was a leaked report that was published today. And the British-based Save the Children group published a report saying 21,000 children are missing in Gaza. This, of course, is in addition to those children who've already been killed, that we know who have been killed in those Israeli bombings. I mean, are there any questions being raised about this in the Biden administration or in the U.S. Congress, for that matter?
Very little. The Biden administration has offered unconditional support to Israel. There was one pause of one weapon shipment to Israel of 2,000-pound bombs, but everything else has been supplied. Netanyahu is so ungrateful that he's angry that that one shipment was paused. He even spoke about that today. Congress is not doing its job at all. They've all lined up to arm Israel to the teeth, and as long as they do that, the slaughter will continue.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.